Welcome everyone, my name is Stefanie Hauer and I'm the host of the podcast series Planetary Business, which tells you how to run your business while staying within the planetary boundaries. Usually I do that in German, but recently I produced an episode on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the feedback was just so overwhelming that I figured everyone should have the chance to learn from my guest everything he or she needs to know about the biggest challenge of our lifetime. Your very survival is dependent on a highly complex network of other species on Earth. You can only breathe because animals, plants and bacteria regulate our atmosphere. And you can eat crop because of that sophisticated climate and water cycle that is regulated by forests. Although we can't live without healthy ecosystems, we put them at risk every day. And I guess we do that because we just don't know enough about what is keeping this planet going. This is why I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Frauke Fischer in my show today. She's an expert on biodiversity. She actually spent, believe it or not, 10 years living in the rainforest. She holds a doctorate in tropical biology. She's a member of the Scientific Council of the WWF in Germany, and she runs her own consulting firm. Frauke, thank you for coming into my show today and for letting me tap into your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
Frauke, you always say that we're making a huge mistake by focusing so much on climate issues while hardly recognizing the dangers of biodiversity loss. You say global warming is about how we live, but biodiversity is about whether we live. What do you mean by that?
When we talk about climate change, we talk about issues that we most likely will be able to handle somehow. But if we talk about biodiversity loss, that is something that is actually eternal. Every species that is lost is gone forever. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are the basis of our existence on Earth.
And there's just so much we cannot do without nature, like fertile soil.
Yeah.
How do you make fertile soil?
Well, I can't do it. You can't do it. Nobody can actually do it except of microbes and very tiny organisms living in soil. And producing fertile soil is actually the most valuable ecosystem service. You can give a bucket of sand to all Nobel Prize winners and you provide them with every technical equipment, money, whatever they like, and they will come back with a bucket of sand.
Before we get into the details, could you please define for us the term biodiversity so that we're all on the same page here?
Biodiversity has 3 different levels. We are talking about diversity within species, so we're talking about genetic diversity. If you look at your siblings, your friends, your boss or your colleagues at your office, you realize that there are actually no genetic copies of yourself. So genetic diversity is the diversity within species. The second aspect of biodiversity is diversity between species. A lion is not a tiger, an apple is not a strawberry. So this is what most people think of when they think about biodiversity. And the third level of biodiversity is the diversity of ecosystems. So a desert is not a coral reef, a swamp is not a tropical rainforest, a rainforest is not a temperate forest.
Okay, so now we've understood the 3 dimensions of biodiversity. Tell me, Frauke, how many species are there on this planet?
That's a very good question and a question nobody can answer at the moment. We have about 2 million species that have a scientific name. We know where they live, but we know that the number of unknown species is much, much larger than these 2 million. So the lowest estimate is about 8 million species, so that would make it 6 million, which we don't know yet.
So that's plants and animals?
Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi. Yeah, it's the diversity of life on Earth. And the highest estimates go to billions of species.
So wait a minute. We continue to eradicate one animal or plant after the other without understanding how many animals there are or plants. And especially, we don't even know what their role is within the ecosystem. Did I get that right?
Well, we have to be afraid, and we should be afraid, that they play a very, very important role in the life of our planet and so eventually in our daily lives as well.
We not just eradicate one species, but a crucial element of a system of interconnected elements, right?
I mean, if you look at a car or a computer, none of us, if you're not a car specialist or a computer specialist, you would probably not dare to take a single part out because you don't know if that is an important part or something that is not so important.
It's like taking a brick out of a wall, but then the wall might collapse.
The problem is that ecosystems are much more complex than a wall. A wall is basically a two-dimensional thing.
Yeah, right.
And you have maybe a couple of hundred similar bricks, but very few bricks have the same role than other bricks. So, the whole system is much, much more complicated.
Let's give an example of how fragile our world is, and thus also our economy, of course. You wrote a book. It's about ecosystems and how they work. So far, it has only been published in German, but of course, you're happy if an international publisher is interested to translate it. The book has an interesting title, which is What Did Mosquitoes Ever Do for Us, Frauke? So we don't like mosquitoes.
Yeah, mosquitoes are actually the only pollinators of cacao flowers. So if there wouldn't be mosquitoes, there wouldn't be any chocolate.
Oh my God.
Yeah, terrible to think about.
And how many
that.
species are there that can pollinate cocoa?
Yeah, as far as we know, it's only 2 species of...
In the world?
Yes, 2 species of very specialized mosquitoes that pollinate cacao.
Wouldn't some other insect come along and say, oh, that's interesting?
This is not the way how evolution functions. It is not that an organism thinks, oh, look, there's an opportunity, then I just change my morphology, for example. If that would be the case, we wouldn't have a problem because then no matter how much we pollute the environment, no matter how hard we hunt down species, etc., there would always be an immediate biological answer. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like this. Evolution is very, very slow, and everything in evolution happens by chance, actually. There's no goal in evolution.
So it could take, say, 100,000 years, 1 million years, until just by accident one other insect fits into this blossom and thinks, okay, that's...
But then since the cacao tree doesn't live 100,000 years or 1 million years, cacao trees would have gone extinct by then. So this is why it wouldn't work.
That was easy to understand, but sometimes it's not that obvious what happens. Say, we kill 100 million shark every year. What does it do to the ecosystem? Mm-hmm. It's not just the shark that we kill, but we kill an important part of the whole system.
Yeah, predators like sharks are important in shaping ecosystems. So if we eradicate those top predators, everything in the lower levels of the food chain could run wild, for example. So the sharks are controlling medium-sized fish. If the sharks are gone, these medium-sized fish increase in abundance.
Say barracudas.
For example, if the population of these medium-sized predators increases, something that's actually called a mesopredator release, that would lead to more predation on smaller fish, for example. The smaller fish might be important in cleaning corals, for example.
Parrotfish.
Parrotfish, yeah. So, and eventually you might eradicate corals by killing sharks, even though at first sight, sharks and corals don't have anything to do with each other.
And as you said in the beginning, we don't know anything about most of the species there are on this planet. So the story that you just told us, we have that like maybe millions of times, and we just don't see what is happening. We don't understand the chain reactions. Yeah. And in this case, the story doesn't end here. You said the corals will be affected if we kill the shark, but corals are so important also to help the sea take up the carbon, right?
Yeah. And then and they are home to not only a couple of fish species, they are home to a large variety of other living creatures in the marine.
Corals protect also the coastline.
They are a natural barrier against floods and storms.
Lots of people live from the fishery in that area. So just by killing shark, we have those huge consequences that we can hardly understand. And
if I can add that, if we look at ecosystems, in total, there are relations that are much, much more complex than either the shark and coral reef example or the mosquito chocolate example.
A lot of species are on the verge of extinction, which means they have not become extinct yet, but they have been so decimated by mankind that they are about to become extinct. Can you give us some figures? To what extent has man spread out compared to wild animals?
Yeah. If we look at the biomass of mammals on our planet, we know that about 36% of that biomass is humans. So if you would weigh all, mammals on Earth, 36% of that mass would be humans. About 60% is livestock. So we can say that only about 4% of all mammal biomass is wild, and the remaining 96% is either humans or livestock.
That's really crazy.
Another number which I think is quite shocking is that the number of chickens in the world is about 3 times as high as the number of all wild birds combined.
That is sick. Give us the big picture. If you look at all the species, how has the population decreased of the wild animals?
Yeah, we have reduced the numbers of almost all vertebrate populations. So vertebrates are animals that have bones, so fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And we have reduced the numbers of these animals by about 68% since 1970. So the species, most of the species are still there, but we've made them all very rare.
We have seen that coming for so many decades, and I wonder how much do we have to destroy until we say that's enough? Tell us something about insects. There was this pretty famous study out of Germany, but then they took it on a global level. What did we learn there?
Well, we learned that since 1980, we have lost about 80% of insects. I remember when I was a child, when we drove through Germany with a car, you had to clean your windshield every 100 kilometers because it was covered with dead insects. If you do this today, you can travel from Munich to Hamburg without cleaning your windshields.
I remember when the study on insects was first published, we had it on the cover where I used to work at that newspaper, and everybody learned about it. And then that was it.
Yeah.
I can't remember people reacting in any form. There was this study by the Indian professor Partha Dasgupta, and he analyzed the financial capital, the human capital, and the natural capital over a period of 30 years. What did he find out?
Well, first, before I come to the numbers, I think I have to explain natural capital, what we're talking about. At the beginning of our talk, we talked about the 3 levels of biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. And these 3 components of biodiversity are important for ecosystem services. So we have regulatory services like regulating the world's climate. We have these basic services like producing fertile soil. We have cultural services. And then we have these called provisioning services. These are things we take out of nature, like timber, for example, or drinking water. And what we can do is we can calculate the monetary value of these ecosystem services. And the economic value of ecosystem services is the natural capital. Then we have financial capital, money, more or less.
We know what that is.
Yeah. And then we have human capital, and that refers to the knowledge of people. So if education increases human capital. Skills and knowledge, yeah. So what the scientists found in the so-called Dasgupta report is they looked at the development of the financial capital, human capital, and natural capital over a time period from 1992 till 2014. And they found that financial capital per person on our planet increased by about 100% in that time period.
That makes sense.
Human capital increased by 13%. So that means that there was an increase in education, in training, whatever. And natural capital decreased by about 40% in 40% in the same time period. And since we know how much we depend on biodiversity and ecosystem services, that's really bad news.
And it seems like this was an old report, but it took them so long to analyze all the data. So since 2014, I guess, we haven't done a very good job with respect to the natural capital. So we are losing natural capital, which doesn't cost us money, but is so important also for the economy, not just for mankind as a whole. I'm very much in favor of putting a price tag on ecosystem services because, the basic problem with capitalism that we have always externalized cost. You don't get punished if you kill animals if they go extinct. Nothing happens. And on the other hand, if you treat soil in a sustainable way, or if you grow your plants in a sustainable way, you don't get incentivized for that. It is what I'm working on, that we can find a system that puts a price tag on everything that is valuable to us. Because this is just our language, the language of money. And why shouldn't we use that also for natural capital and ecosystem services? It's something society has to work out.
Yeah.
But then what do you say about carbon credits, if you get carbon credits for growing trees?
That is one of the interesting developing financial tools that might help us to protect biodiversity and ecosystem services, because here we have a market for buying and selling carbon credits, and you can, of course, calculate how much carbon is sequestered in your forest. Still, it is not a market and a currency for biodiversity, but it is, in a way, it is a proxy for that.
It's a first step, let's just say that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's now time that we give our audience an overview of the reasons for the dramatic decline in biodiversity in the world. So which are the key drivers?
Well, we have land use change, destroying tropical forests or doing other forms of agriculture.
You were mentioning agriculture. Some certain crop is really the biggest problem, like beef, soy, palm oil, and cocoa, right?
Yeah.
That's the worst.
Yeah, the main driver is actually making space for cattle. So huge areas, especially in the tropics, are deforested to have a very small number of cows per hectare because the soil is very poor. You need huge areas to produce beef. And then there are commodities like cacao and coffee, which are drivers of deforestation. The chocolate consumption in Germany is the main driver of deforestation in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire.
What else do we need to know?
We have these direct effects of hunting, fishing, etc. Then we have climate change, which is a big problem for many species because we have a loss of habitat. If you have marine turtles and they have their breeding beaches, and with rising sea levels, they vanish. And so we see a decline in the marine turtle population, for example.
And it's just getting too hot for some animals.
Of course, if you look at, you look at animals and plants living in the European Alps, for example, eventually, for a certain period of time, they are able to move to higher elevations, but eventually they reach the tip of the mountain and then they become extinct.
What about invasive species?
This is actually something where conservationists have resigned, I think, more or less.
And then it's crazy, but we dump more than 200,000 different kinds of chemicals in the environment without understanding the consequences.
Yeah, you're talking about pollution, and this is, of course, a big problem for many, many species. We are just destroying the environment. We are polluting, we are poisoning their food, and this is a main driver of extinction of species as well.
The deforestation in the rainforest is the worst you can do when it comes to biodiversity. And also it has an effect on the climate, right?
When we log or burn these large forests, that of course emits a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. And up to 25% of the CO2 emissions today probably relate to destruction of forests, mainly rainforests. Yeah, and that has huge effects on our climate. Rainforests generate rain. Rainforest is not located in an area where there is a lot of rain, but a rainforest is a forest that generates rain.
How much have we already destroyed of the Amazon?
Yeah, so we know that there's a tipping point when we destroy 22 to 24% of the Amazon, it will turn gradually into a savanna. Today, we have destroyed already 17%, and it is going on. So even though we know how important it is to protect the Amazon rainforest, we are actually increasing its destruction. And part of the Amazon are sources of CO2 emissions instead of sinks.
What would that look like? You were talking about this tipping point. Is it from one day to the other that this whole rainforest becomes a savanna? Or what do you expect?
That is a good question, actually. We don't really know. If you think of a tipping point, let's say you have a glass of water and you push it to the border of your table, then eventually the glass will fall down. So this is a very rapid change. In terms of ecosystems, it is, in geological terms, it will also be a very rapid change. But a rapid change might mean that it takes a year or 5 years or 10 years. We don't know this. But what we know is that if this tipping point is reached, the Amazon or any other natural system will change into another stage that is also very, very stable, but not very favorable for us. Meaning droughts in the United States. The United States and Canada are very much, and Central America as well, are very much dependent on the Amazon forest producing rain.
So the rainforest produces rain that falls down in the United States.
Yes.
That enables the states to have agriculture.
Yes.
This means we need to end any kind of deforestation immediately. And I'm not just talking about rainforest. We should stop any kind of additional degradation of land. Experts say we must define a goal like the climate neutrality. They call it land degradation neutrality. We've seen so many pictures of what is happening in our forests. But tell me, what is happening under the sea where it's dark, where we don't see it? Actually, I'm afraid to ask you because I don't think we're doing a great job down there.
I mean, the destruction of tropical rainforests is still going on more or less unnoticed in Central Europe. And if we look at marine systems, if you look at the large oceans of our world, the situation is even more severe. And we have a terrible problem with overfishing. All fish populations are exploited to the maximum extent.
Of the larger fish, 80% of the population has already been destroyed.
Yeah, even the smaller fish and even the more remote populations, they have been exploited to the maximum possible extent. I think on a global scale, we can say there's no fish population where fishery can be increased.
If we overfish a certain size of fish or a certain species of fish, how does it affect the ecosystem?
What happens is when you start to fish the larger fish like cod or tuna, you disrupt the food web and the food chain. The smaller predatory fish start to overhunt the even smaller species, and this has effects eventually on other parts of the ecosystem.
So overfishing also disturbs always the entire ecosystem and not just a certain species. Let's talk about bycatch, which is a weird word because it sounds like a positive side effect. I read that we have 40 million tons of bycatch every year. Why?
If you use fishing nets, for example, you fish every single species that comes in front of your net. It is not possible to fish just the species you're targeting.
And tell us something about the ground trawls. How do they harm the seabed?
It's like tilling on land. You disturb, of course, the sediment because your target fish are species that are hiding in the sand. And that gives you the opportunity to catch those fish, but it leaves a destroyed ecosystem behind.
So say, for instance, also in colder water, you have corals, and corals have taken hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years to grow. And you just have one ground trawl that destroys everything?
Yeah, so this is as if you would go hunting roe deer and you would log all 500-year-old oak trees in a forest just to catch one roe deer.
So it's highly inefficient and utterly destructive.
It is.
What we're doing. Let's look at this from an economic point of view. If we have fewer and fewer of these eco-services that are for free so far, what kind of impact does that have on the availability of food and on the price level?
It has a huge impact. For example, pollination in Central Europe alone has an annual value of more than 150 billion euros. So if we reduce the number of pollinators, for example, of course, the price of fruit increases because we have less fruit. If you have less fertile soil, you need more artificial fertilizer maybe, so that increases the price for wheat, for example.
Listening to you makes me think that there is a tipping point for humanity's food supply. Have we reached that?
Yeah, there are approximately 400,000 species of plants on our planet. 200,000 of these are edible. 200 are actually eaten by humans somewhere on this planet on a more or less regular basis. And more than 50% of all calories consumed by humans on our planet every day just come from 3 species of plants, from wheat, rice, and corn. And when we come, just to make a loop to the start of our conversation, we have a very reduced genetic variety in these main crops. So It is not very wise to reduce the number of species, and then it's not very wise to reduce the genetic diversity in these food plants.
So we're highly dependent on very few crops.
Yes.
And as we have learned, on only a couple of countries that can supply the crop. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, why the price is going to rise.
Yeah, and it's going to rise in a very unpredictable way. The more we interfere with natural processes, the more volatile the whole system gets.
What is so important to know is that the planetary boundaries that I'm talking about in this podcast a lot, they are interrelated in many cases. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk to you about how climate and biodiversity go hand in hand, or if we have to focus on one or the other. Which one is more important now?
We know that climate change is a main driver of biodiversity loss, but we also know that biodiversity is our best ally in fighting climate change. If we restore natural ecosystems like peatland, they sequester a large amount of carbon. The same is true for the restoration of forested land, for example. There's a new publication on increasing the biodiversity in soil, which would lead to a huge increase in sequestration of carbon in fertile soil. So, yeah, as I said, biodiversity is our best ally in fighting climate change.
Say that whatever we do to protect biodiversity is also always good for the climate, but not necessarily vice versa?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Everything you do to enhance biodiversity, to protect biodiversity, has a positive impact on climate, and it never ever has a negative impact on climate. But doing something for the climate might harm biodiversity.
And of all the money, which is quite a bit, that we are investing in climate solutions, only 3% get invested into nature-based solutions.
Yeah. And this is a big mistake. It is much, much cheaper to invest in nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration than in technical solutions.
What many people don't know when we talk about the climate is that it's not just about the man-made emissions. These days are long over. The man-made climate change has already led to processes like melting tundra or bushfires, drying wetlands that have gotten completely out of hands and that are accelerating, in fact, climate change in their own way. How does that work? How important is that?
That is very important. Trees like oak trees or beech trees under thermal stress have lower photosynthesis rates and hence can sequester less CO2.
So greenhouse gas emissions cause global heating, and global heating causes processes that cause more global heating.
So there we see something that will lead to an increase in CO2 emissions in the next couple of years.
You know, they're saying optimism is a moral duty. Is optimism dangerous and stupid in this case?
Well, if it's informed optimism, it might be a good option, of course. If it's optimism out of ignorance, it is not good. The window of opportunity is closing fast, and we don't have another couple of years discussing it.
What would you like the media to do? Because unfortunately, I think a lot of what you're saying is not common knowledge. It should be.
We are talking about nature as if nature is something nice to have, but nature is at the center of human well-being. It's at the center of fighting climate change. It is at the center of our economy. So I would like the media to cover this topic in a much more serious way as they are doing it, and a more frequent way than they are doing it today.
So we need everybody to help and to spread the word. They can contact you on LinkedIn.
Sure.
My last question, Frauke. Of all the people that have been listening now, what do you say? How many will just think, oh, this is so sad? And how many will actually question their personal impact on biodiversity and change just a little bit of their lifestyle or of the way they run their businesses?
My expectation is that the majority will listen to it and think, ooh, that someone should do something about it. And very few people will actually change. But it depends. If they were listening to our podcast with their peers, these peers might put pressure on them, or everybody might feel a certain pressure of the peer group. And these people I expect to change their habits and their way of dealing with nature.
We will see. Thank you, Frauke. Thanks for being on my show. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Planetary Business. This is an independent podcast and not funded by ads. If you want to support this podcast, give us a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify and tell everyone you know about it.